Greetings. This is for the 4th grade Math Expressions Unit 7 review prior to some assessment. Fancy dancy assessment time is coming. And we just want to make sure that we take one last round with some of these ideas about decimals. Let's talk about Item 5 in the review. It asks us to explain how to compare 3/4 and 3/5, which is a little more challenging than just comparing them. But if we start off by looking, by looking at 3/4 and 3/5, there are a few different ways we can go about this. But what I noticed right away is that we have the same numerator, so the same part of the whole. 3 out of 4 and 3 out of 5. Now the thing that is important here, if I'm explaining, is to explain that even though we have the same number of pieces, so it might seem like it's equal, because in whole numbers 3 is equal to 3, what we have to look at is the size of the pieces, right? And when we talk about fourths versus fifths, and I'm going to have to eyeball this because my fifths are not going to come out quite as neat as my fourths. It's a little hard to see, but what I notice is that fifths are slightly smaller pieces. So if I have 3 smaller pieces compared to 3 slightly larger pieces, that means the 3 slightly larger pieces are the greater amount. Because again, we have that interesting thing in fractions that tells us that the larger the denominator, the smaller size pieces we have broken the whole into. All right. Now, I don't know why I said this was just decimals, because we had fractions and decimals going on here. Now, if we take a look at items 7 and 8, they ask us to simplify each fraction. This is a hugely important skill, mainly because you're going to be asked to do it forever in math class. When you deal with fractions from now on, unless it's stated otherwise, most math teachers are going to say, hey, why didn't you simplify? So what does it mean to simplify or reduce to lowest terms? It means that we look at a fraction like item 8, which is 15 over 40, and we ask ourselves, is there a way we can express this in numbers that are easier to visualize and understand? Can we make it look simpler without changing the value? So we're finding an equivalent fraction, but a simpler one. The way we do that is to say, okay, well, 15 and 40, do they have a common factor? And remember, you can always list factors, so the factors of 15 would be like 1 and 15, because 1 times 15 is 15, and 3 and 5, because 3 times 5 is 15. And 40 is going to have a lot more factors, 1 and 40, and 2 and 20, and 5 and 8, and 4 and 10. When I look, I notice that 5 is a common factor for both of these numbers. So what I can do is divide both the numerator and the denominator by 5. As we so often do, what happens to the numerator happens also to the denominator. When I divide both by 5, I have 3 for the numerator and I have 8 for the denominator. Now remember, I wasn't just asked to find an equivalent fraction, they said simplify. So I have to look at the new equivalent fraction, 3/8, and say, now, is there a way to simplify it further? Can I reduce these terms through division? And I can't, because the only common factor of 3 and 8 is 1. And dividing by 1 isn't going to change anything about how this fraction looks. So 3/8 is simplest form. All right, one more for part one. We're asked, here's the decimal part. I knew we'd get there eventually. We're asked to write each number in decimal form. So we may have word form, we may have a fraction or a mixed number. In theory, we could also have expanded form, although we don't on this review. So let's take a look at, how about item 13? They give us the mixed number 12 and 4 over 100. Or 12 and 4 hundredths. Hundredths, that's what I want to hear, because I know about tenths and hundredths. If I imagine kind of that place value chart in my head, and I think about how I say this number, 12 and 4 hundredths, I know, okay, and there is a decimal in this number, because in math, that's pretty much what and means when you're saying numbers. And 12 is a whole number. It is in this mixed number, so it will be in the equivalent decimal form. 12 and 4 hundredths is the part I want to keep in mind. It's not going to be 12.4, because that would make it 12 and 4 tenths. Because that place value section to the right of the decimal is tenths. Remember, dimes versus pennies. And 4 hundredths, that's pennies. So I need to make sure my 4 is in the hundredths place. Since I don't have any tenths in this number, that means I'm going to have a 0 to show no tenths in this number, and a 4 in the hundredths place. 12 and 4 hundredths. If I look at one of the items that is written in word form, like item 14, I see when I read it on my review, it says 21 and 35 hundredths. Now, I can start out trying to write that as a decimal. If it helps, though, feel free to write it as a fraction first. If you're kind of a fraction thinker like me, then it's okay to say, okay, 21 and 35 hundredths. There's the fractional part. Now from here, I'm going to treat it just like I did item 13. 21 I know is the whole number part, and is the way we refer to the decimal. And 35 hundredths, again, I'm picturing that place value chart, and I know I have tenths, and then hundredths, dimes, and then pennies. Well, if I think of it as 35 cents, I have a pretty good idea of how it goes. And I also know if it's 35 hundredths, then that 35 has to end in the hundredths place. So 21 and 35 hundredths, right there in the hundredths place. Okay, part two, going to do a little more with problem solving, but TTFN.